Welcome to Agile to Agility podcast with Miljan, Bajic.
Major show alert!
The very first value we wrote is individuals and interactions.
Let's take this another level.
And so he said, well, what do they do then? And I said, well, they take what works. They adapt things if they think that's valuable. They discard the things that don't seem to be relevant to them. And they synergize all of that with everything else that they've done already, for better or worse.
I don't know much about who James Priest is, and I'm sure a lot of people also don't. So maybe could you take us on your journey and kind of how you got into this space that you're currently in, and what got you interested into organizational effectiveness and this whole
Sure.
Yes.
Well, I won't make you endure my entire life history, but I was in England. You go to school, you leave school at 16, you go to college and then to university, and my mother had very big ideas for me about going to university. Mm-hmm. But actually, I was also a musician. I was a pianist. And for better and worse, I got involved with a band. And so I dropped out at the age of 18 and was a semi-professional musician for some years, which was a lot of fun. And somewhere inside, I had a niggling idea I should do something a bit more responsible. So I also founded a couple of businesses. And I was actually, at that time, interested in nature. I'd worked a lot with construction when I was younger. Mm-hmm. As a kid with my father and living in a rural environment. And so I got into landscape design and construction. So I had a private business for private properties and also a commercial business. Anyway, I remember asking myself a few times, this can't be it. And when I was 26 years old, there was a series of events happening in my life at that time. And I ended up getting introduced to, you could call it it's a kind of psychological or consciousness tool. So my partner at the time was having a difficult time with a few things, and she reached out for help with that. And I got really interested in the process that she got involved with, which was called voice dialogue. It was developed by a couple, Hal and Sidra Stone from the States. Hal was a Jungian analyst and Sidra was a psychologist. They'd got together, it was their second marriage in the 70s. And they'd vowed to never repeat the same problems that they had in their first marriages. And after about 6 months, they started to see the same patterns emerging. And so rather than be dismayed, they decided to explore that. And at that time, there was a lot of exploration being done around this idea of psychology of selves, or this idea that the psyche is multiple. And so, and there was some techniques, like facilitating different parts of somebody, giving a part a space in the room and having a dialogue and so on. So they started experimenting with this. And out of that came a method that's gained a lot of traction today called voice dialogue. And around it was what they came to call the psychology of selves. Anyway, I'll get to why this is relevant in the context of sociocracy soon. But the basic idea is that, everybody's unique, right? So we're all born with our own kind of unique tendencies and traits, but then, the environment influences us, our familial environment and the culture in which we grow. So this nature-nurture debate, it's not really a debate, both are relevant somehow. But if you look at, or one way to make sense of human development is that we tend to lean into or identify with certain behaviors that appear to get our needs better met within whichever social context we're in. And with some encouragement sometimes from those around us, including kind of negative feedback, we can disown certain other aspects of ourselves that otherwise we would quite naturally and freely express. So the basic idea is that by the time we reach adulthood, we're a kind of adapted version of our full selves, with some parts known to ourselves and given freedom to express, some part known to ourselves but not shared openly or explicitly with the world, but a whole bunch of aspects or potential in us that's also not developed. So anyway, I was really fascinated in this work, and the basic idea was, by really giving space to these different identifications, like the part of me that was really identified with pleasing people and was very unnerved if people seemed displeased with me, or the part of me that needed to know the answer to everything, and not knowing wasn't really a safe space for me to be in, and so on. So I took a deep dive into this because I was really fascinated by the question, who am I really? You know? And so this was when I was 26, and I made a decision during that year, one, that I wanted to pursue more what was meaningful for me, and I was discovering a whole new bunch of meaning at that time. And secondly, I'd been very entrepreneurial up until that point. But I had this realization that actually it would probably serve me better if I was more paying attention to myself and to life, and listening more for where I felt a sense of pull, a sense of invitation, you know, and that rather than coming up with a plan around what I was going to do, it's been more responsive to the moment instead.
Yeah. Is that awareness that you're talking about, just higher awareness, or is it something else?
Well, awareness is a precursor to greater consciousness, right? But I can behave like an idiot. I can be aware I'm behaving like an idiot, and I still behave like an idiot, right? So awareness helps. Without awareness, then it's very difficult to intentionally change a thing, right? But in and of itself, it's just a stepping stone. So it's really it's consciousness work, I guess. You know, it's the journey for me was deeply insightful and a bit addictive in a way. It's like I was just discovering the identifications through which I viewed the world. And as I peeled off layers, I discovered more aspects of myself. And one really interesting facet of that was their perspective on judgment. So, you know, we can negatively judge people and feel repelled somehow by people, but we can also positively judge people. You know, it's like we put them on a pedestal somehow, we fall in love with them, you know, this kind of thing. And they saw judgment as a torchlight that helped us to identify identifications that we had, and also in the mirror of what we projected onto others to see aspects that were also essential to ourselves. But my point was, this led to a really big turnaround for me in my life, and this pivot towards listening for invitation and pursuing what was meaningful, you know, and kind of not just in my head, but also in my heart, in terms of getting a sense where I could best contribute. And that led me into working for nearly a decade with at-risk teenagers. I trained as an integrative counselor. I developed a private practice. And early on in that period, so I was around 27, I was introduced to Sociocracy as a concept. And a very low resolution introduction to the Sociocratic circle method in the context of working with an organization to support them in transforming some conflict into a more creative opportunity for them to learn and grow. So that's where my first induction into organizations came, but it was more by accident and through invitation, because I was already starting to work within that field.
And I'm assuming like that whole approach and idea behind Sociocracy resonated with you because of that change. Like, what was your first reaction when you learned about, at that high level, about Sociocracy?
Yeah, well, so back then there was a single web page in English about the Sociocratic circle method. Everything else was in Dutch. A lot of it was difficult to find. And I had a hand-typed document, literally typed on a typewriter with correction ink, you know, describing from somebody's kind of own account of what the Sociocratic circle method was. So with that kind of single-page document, we experimented with selecting people by consent and consent decision-making, organizing in circles and linking within the organization. And in combination with some other practices as well, nonviolent communication was something I was introduced to at that point, but also this perspective of judgment as a kind of torchlight, as a kind of indicator of where we're polarized somehow. Over 2 years, I saw a radical transformation in this organization, and I was really impressed by the efficacy of these different patterns, basically, from the Sociocratic circle method. But the other thing that really struck me, and this goes to the heart of the history of sociocracy. So Gerard Endenburg, who developed the Sociocratic circle method, he was a student of Kees Bucher, who founded a school in the 1920s in the Netherlands with his wife, Betty Cadbury. That's of the Cadbury family. They were so disenfranchised by the mainstream education system that they decided to create a school. And part of the idea was very much influenced by Quaker practices around engaging the kids in the decision-making alongside the adults that were involved as well. So it kind of became this self-organizing system back in the 1920s, and that school's still around today. But the Quakers, it's an interesting kind of Christian sect. They had this idea that was seen as quite heretical over recent centuries, that God or authority wasn't just some external entity that you bow to, but that there was a bit of God in everybody, or they talked about the light within. Right? So another way of looking at that is just looking at distributed intelligence, the idea of collective intelligence. When we're orientating in complexity, no one of us is smart enough to navigate complexity alone. We need each other. And yet it's so challenging sometimes as human beings to be able to come together and cooperate and collaborate in a way where we can arrive at agreement together, because we so often get caught in polarization with one another because of these judgments, right? And we're judging one another because we're seeing behaviors in another that reflect something that in a distant past for us somewhere demonstrated some kind of threat or meant that we might not get our needs met, So we're standing on one foot, if you like, and banging into each other. So this was what really fascinated me about the Sociocratic circle method, and especially consent decision-making, because what I saw was that where I was working on the intrapsychic level in my own process, but also with other people as well, to create this more integrated organization intrapsychically, the consent decision-making process was it's an optionable agreement among stakeholders to come together and to show up and to bring each perspective, but not with the idea of fighting to see whoever would win, but to kind of transcend that binary conundrum towards a more both and perspective on the world, where the essential value of different points of view were kind of synergized towards the emergence of a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. That's
so
the thing.
Maybe I want to pause here because I think this is really important, and I know we might go a little bit off topic, but this is like key to everything, in my opinion. In a sense, you've touched upon a couple of points. One is the consciousness and understanding, like, I don't know, as sometimes is referred to as cognitive growth or adult development. But there's a tight correlation, in my opinion, between that growth, that transcendence, maybe, if you want to call it, and how we see the world, or our perspectives, our worldviews, right? So a lot of times, the conflict is between these views, or maybe how we judge, or could you maybe talk a little bit more, or what is your perspective on maybe some of the there's a lot of, over the last, 60, 70, 80 years on cognitive growth and adult development stages. What is your thought on that, and how important is it when it comes to looking at the world that we currently live, the complex world, and how our approaches to dealing with that complex world and environment?
Well, so the term adult development, I mean, it's a loaded term for many people, and for a myriad of different reasons. I think it's fair to say, and most people could probably agree with this, if you look at the evolution of us as a species, we've been maturing, we've been learning, we've been developing in different ways and accruing wisdom through the hard-earned lessons of those that came before us, and then applying our interpretations of that to orientating in the world today. And I think it's fair to say that if we don't screw things up so badly that this place becomes uninhabitable for us in the future, then there's a long runway still for us to continue to develop and grow. And I'm personally very curious about that and excited about that potential, even though I don't think it's guaranteed for the majority of us to carry on down that road, So what was interesting for me about the work of Hal and Sidra, and this is just very personal to me, was it wasn't about like becoming an adult. It was about bringing consciousness to all of the different aspects of me, which included different aspects of the child in me, aspects of the elder in me, aspects of the feminine and the masculine in me, just whatever I kind of discovered as I was peeling off those layers. And so you mentioned about transcendence. I think transcendence is a bit of a tricky term as well. People can kind of use it as an excuse to avoid the hard, concrete knocks of life. Sure, there's a more kind of spiritual side of ourselves that's beyond the kind of concrete and the mundane, but at the other end of the scale, we're physical beings and we're very much here in the world, and that comes with responsibilities and very real consequences, including inevitable death, for now at least. So Hal and Sidra's work it wasn't about transcending things. It was about integrating. It was more about expanding ourselves to be as honest as possible with ourselves and with who we are, And so it's a kind of surrender into being. And the challenge with that is there's a good reason why we identify with certain behaviors, right? All of us. It's to avoid being too vulnerable. And so, but behaviors we learn and become habituated in our earlier life can sometimes even end up bringing about the very things we're trying to avoid in later life. And the more vulnerable we get, if that's happening out of consciousness, then we tend to double down and identify even more, when what we need to do is kind of disidentify from those habitual ways of behaving and be able to tap into other ways that complement. It's not to replace, but it's more on a pole. It's not opposites, but just complementary ends of a pole. So if I'm totally identified with pleasing everybody else all the time, I've got no way of caring for myself because I'm not in touch with what pleases me and what would be needed for me, But if I'm embracing both sides, and in a moment when there's a demand on me from another, perhaps, or a situation that might warrant that, I can also tap into what my own needs are right now and what's going to be important for me. And in holding that tension between opposites, it enables me to make a more kind of intentional choice rather than running on my habits.
And it's like very context. I mean, like when you said that moment is all about context and having that awareness or consciousness about like, hey, which way am I pulling, and being conscious about what you're doing in that specific situation. Is that what it's kind of what you're describing? Yeah, and it's one way I find this simple to be able to grasp it conceptually is it's just about developing beyond a kind of binary view of the world. It's developing the capacity for nuance, recognizing the essential value in different points of view, both not just outside of ourselves but within ourselves, among those different aspects of our inner contradiction, if you like. But fundamental to that is the fact that if we go up against a habituated way of behaving and perceiving the world, then it's inevitable that we will be confronted by the vulnerability that behavior sought to help us avoid. And so that's the challenge, right? Because, we can go out there and be all powerful in the world and cause effect all over the place. But what we often run from is the fact that we can be affected by things, right? And so we're strategizing to make sure that we're only affected in positive ways and we avoid the negative ways.
And that's what this inner kind of family of identifications is helping us to achieve. So my point is that to acknowledge vulnerability is, on the one hand, a vulnerable thing to do, but at the same time, it's a precondition towards transformation and being able to realize a more integrated version of ourselves, right? Because if I'm consciously holding the baby, so to speak, then all of those internal parent aspects of me that were trying to take care of it somehow relax a bit, because it's like, okay, finally there's somebody home,
Yeah.
And in the absence of that, they're just going to keep running and doing the things that they've always done. Let me see if I can help us both out to make a segue towards the modern day and Sociocracy 3.0, right? Because S3 is a menu of human behavior patterns that have emerged through human collaborative endeavors across time. And they've prevailed and evolved because of their usefulness in certain contexts. And in organizations today, we've got people like you and me, all of us who've gone through our own developmental journeys, all of us unique in our own rights, but also influenced by whichever familial, social, cultural contexts have got their hands on us somehow. And we're trying to work together towards some kind of common objective in an organization. And so much as our habitual ways of doing things work, there's not really any need to look at doing anything different. I mean, why change if everything's good enough as it is, right? We've got enough to think about without changing things as well. But what happens for all of us, of course, is that we bump into situations where, despite our best efforts, the results we see are sometimes different to what we expect or wish to see. And that's a vulnerable moment, right? Especially if we're working so damn hard and bringing everything we know and have to that situation, and it's still not good enough, individually and together somehow. And so one way I like to help people understand S3 is these behavior patterns were there long before S3 was. But if you're struggling with your current habitual ways of dealing with things, and you're banging into situations where it's just not good enough, and you're prepared to acknowledge the vulnerability that comes from that somehow, and you're looking for alternatives, then there might be some patterns within the menu of S3 that are going to be helpful for you, at least to consider, to enrich your current approach, but also as a contrast, which in its own way will help you become more conscious of your habitual ways of doing things before. And so I'm saying this to try and tie that whole story together: psychology of selves, meeting sociocracy.
Exactly. And the way that I see it is, and maybe first let's come back to S3 and your journey, as far as maybe fast forward to early, or I think you said it was 2014, 2015 of S3 or Sociocracy 3.0. So maybe let's just bring everybody back, and some people might not be familiar with what S3 is. So maybe describe now on your journey how you got started with S3. And then I would like to tie a lot of what you said into S3 and also back to that consciousness and our willingness. One of the challenges that I see is people seeing some of these approaches that are part of, or these patterns, as maybe too far-fetched or not, not maybe for my environment, because of that precondition, like you said, we're so used to certain things. But let's come back to, how did you get started with S3, and you co-created that, right?
Yeah, well, or co-discovered it, maybe, is a more humble way of putting it. So, well, I played around with the Sociocratic circle method for many years, since 2001. Around 2008-9, I started to get the idea that in the future, there would be more of a place for sociocracy-inspired thinking in the world. And so I got involved with a startup organization called Sociocracy UK around 2010, we were looking to help raise awareness around sociocracy and the Sociocratic circle method in the UK. And I was a bit of a evangelist for the Sociocratic circle method at that point. I thought it was pretty cool. And I think mainly I was so excited about it because I was so naive about organizational development in general. And I didn't really know about much else. So, and I personally had such a good experience with it. And because of its overlap with these other areas that I was much more experienced in, you know, and entrenched in. So by 2014, I was in the nonprofit and social sector. I think I was the most booked sociocracy trainer in the world that year. And I, you know, I can't profess to have been like the world's greatest expert, but I was just seemed to, following that invitation, I just seemed to keep finding myself in the right place. And I was really passionate about it. And then I met Bernard Bockelbrink in a workshop organized by Lily David, who's the other co-developer of Esri and now my wife as well. And he was an Agile coach. He'd worked as a CTO. He had a background in software development. And he came to the workshop and I spoke to him in the break and he said, I'm here because I'm interested in what sociocratic thinking can bring to help get over this hurdle in many organizations where there's a huge investment into agile operations, you know, agile product and service development. But you kind of hit this weather front somewhere up the system. And on the other end is the business end. And it's a really kind of uncomfortable and often unproductive and wasteful kind of situation. And he was looking to sociocracy for ideas about how to bring agility, you know, just a more agile perspective to the whole system and a more lean approach rather than a lot of the waste that can come with unnecessary decision-making hierarchy within systems. So fast forward 3 months, he sent me an email with a link to a webpage called a webpage. It was like 140 PDF pages with illustrations of his first draft of an interpretation of his understanding of sociocracy synergized with aspects of Agile and Lean. And what he wanted to do was create a set of free learning resources for the tech industry, sharing these ideas. And I took a look and I didn't know very much at all about Agile and Lean back then. And I read it and I thought, well, he's got some understanding, but doesn't know so much about sociocracy either. I better go see this guy. So I went back to Berlin and we spent a week together with the idea of creating these resources. And at the end of the week, we had like 5 times more on our backlog than we'd had at the start. So I decided to go back there a few weeks later. And it was during that second visit that we realized that there was this potential for really like creating resources that could really help people to learn some of these different patterns that we were seeing. And the pinnacle moment was a moment when Bernard asked me, based on all of my experience with the Sociocratic circle method over the years, how many organizations did I know of that had kind of stayed true to the method, you know, and were just running the whole system over the years? And I said, well, I don't know any actually. And I, just to be fair, I think there's a few, but there's not many in the world today. And so he said, well, what do they do then? And I said, well, they take what works. They adapt things if they think that's valuable. They discard the things that don't seem to be relevant to them. And they synergize all of that with everything else that they've done already, for better or worse. And he said to me, then I think we should tell the world about that. And that's how Esri was born. We decided to rip down the Sociocratic circle method, many frameworks and methodologies coming out of the world of Agile and Lean, and look for key patterns there that we could articulate in a manner where it would give people the option to kind of take these building blocks, you know, rather than having to take frameworks and methodologies as a whole.
And that's so key. I mean, like, you know, and like I've been doing these interviews for, I don't know, a couple of months now. And like every person that I respect their opinion in Agile, outside of Agile, right, it says, you we're foolish to think about like frameworks will solve our problems, and we're selling, people are buying it, companies are buying them. I do a lot of training in that aspect. But going back to your story, how many organizations do you actually know that apply these frameworks and have not modified those? And I think the future of and it's kind of like you said, it's something that I listened that you said, like, this is like wisdom of life. S3 is a remix. It's like, it's something that we've known. It's not necessarily completely new. And I feel like the future of organizational change, organizational human is based on these patterns, and exactly what you just described in that scenario. It's like you take what works, you evolve it, you change it, and there's no recipe for it. Yet, in our world, there's a lot of demand for that. Give me a recipe. And I want to bring this back to that consciousness. How much our need for predictability, unease with complexity and uncertainty is driving desire for recipes and frameworks? Because there's, I think, connection between why frameworks are so popular methodologies and why they're so unsuccessful versus these pattern-based custom approaches seem to be what really reality is all about.
Yeah. Well, maybe you can kind of come back a bit on your own question there. So for you, why is it they're so unsuccessful? So from your perspective?
Yeah. So maybe I'll share my thoughts on that. I think each context is different, right? So, and I talk about it like having a recipe without ingredients for that recipe, right? It's great if you have all the ingredients, but if you don't have all the ingredients, you got to make something that's somewhat tasteful with what you have. And a lot of times, if you think about scaling frameworks, if you think about even Scrum, if we look at, the most popular framework in the space that at least I'm working, people can't even implement Scrum, which is a pretty basic framework. How could you, some of these frameworks that have a lot of different patterns, practices, principles embedded in them, on the surface they look good, and when CEO or somebody that's responsible for implementing change looks at it like, oh yeah, this looks good. But if we don't fully understand complexity, in my opinion, it's easy to buy something or to see the value in it, and then when you actually try to implement it, you're like, oh shit, what do I do now, and how do I get out of this situation, because it's not working. Because going back to what you said, ask any agile coach or transformation, but not necessarily transformation, the same question that Bernard asked you, how many organizations do you know that implemented Scrum across the company and they're truly doing that year after year? Most of them would say they tweaked it. There's no. So that's my response to it.
Yeah.
Patterns, principles-based approaches, and what S3 stands for is, I think, future of where we're going into and dealing with complexity. And I think probably S3 is going to evolve, but it's those type of approaches or pattern-based approaches that have much better chance against complexity rather than what we've seen last 10, 20 years with agile and lean frameworks. So
yeah, well, I would agree a lot with what you're saying. To be fair, and to pluck out that grain of gold or truth in some of these bigger systems for organizational transformation that we see, S3 is a menu of kind of micro methods, if you like. You could break it down and say, well, to be fair, there's several micro frameworks and several micro methods. So one way to look at this situation is around scope and scale, right? It's like, how many kind of these micro methods and frameworks are there under the hood of this meta framework? And what's the need that pulling in any of these things helps to address? Because, I've spoken to people in organizations who opted for Holacracy, for example, and they went all in according to the recommendation of Holacracy 1 and had a terrible time. I've spoken to people in organizations who went all in And now they've kept what works, changed things that didn't, and thrown out a bunch of stuff. And it's even different throughout the organization. Different people emphasize different aspects of, or use different aspects of Holacracy more or less. But then you've got these other people in organizations who say, man, best thing we ever did. We pulled in Holacracy by the book. It was really difficult in many ways, but it really, really helped us, and we like it. And I think and it helped us deal with the challenges that we were facing. So I think it's, rather than kind of falling into that binary conclusion that no, anything over this size framework is bad. One, we've got personal choice. And of course, in an organization of scale, it's not just one person's choice, it's everybody's, of course. And then you've got need and context. And so I don't want to throw large frameworks out as being antiquated, and of yesteryear. I think in most cases, they're going to be a stepping stone. We could look at Scrum as a stepping stone. It's like, it's going to make you learn how to collaborate, right? if you didn't know how.
Exactly. But like, for instance, this is where also you're going to trip. In S3, a lot of it has to do with decentralizing and how authority is distributed, right? So like, if you have Scrum, you could implement Scrum, but without changing the authority, and accountability. So who makes the decisions? Then that falls apart. So my thought on all of this, yes, context matters, and there's some of these frameworks are great stepping stone. I tell people SAFe is a great stepping stone. Like, if your organization, for government specifically, it's a great stepping stone. And you've been in public sector, you probably, I don't know how it is in Europe, but here in the United States, it's a pretty messed up situation. So for them to do anything in that step is great. But like, if you don't fully understand the reason why in complex environment we want to decentralize, why we want to create guidelines for, like, in a sense, for allow people to figure things out, then it's almost like misunderstanding and not fully being able to depict these patterns. I think ultimately what we need to do is be able to depict and take these patterns apart and say, how do we create new patterns for our context are based on this? What have we learned, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And this is maybe, if we look at a Holacracy implementation, I spoke with John Bunch recently.
I saw that.
He was responsible for bringing Holacracy into Zappos. Not responsible for arriving there, but he was responsible for helping a lot of people learn how to use Holacracy there. And he was saying, and I spoke to many people at Zappos over the last couple of years, they were mostly happy with where that Holacracy implementation took them. Even several of the people who left at that time came back later into Zappos again. But it was always intended as a stepping stone somehow. And what it did is it kicked everybody in the ass. And of course, not everybody liked it. And there's a whole moral question, and this conversation around imposition, of transformation versus invitation-based change, as Daniel Mezek calls it, and so on. Exactly. I think that's an important conversation to have. But my point is that choosing something like that and running with it can be a great stepping stone. And one of the arguments you hear Brian Robertson give, one of the arguments you hear advocates for the Sociocratic circle method is, if you don't implement the whole thing, then you can't know if the things you miss are critical for that whole system to remain coherent and do what it says on the tin. And I think that's a fair argument. And if we zoom into the micro, if you look at particular patterns from S3, some of the process patterns, you can shortcut them, but there's a bloody good reason why those process patterns include all of the steps that they do. And it's not about a rule that says you can't ever change them, but as you were saying, what's important is, do we understand the principles that are behind these patterns? Exactly. And do we understand why these patterns were the particular patterns that emerged and prevailed over time? Why were they useful for our ancestors? Why didn't they evolve in a different way and look like something different today? And I think that's one of the challenges at the other end, is a pattern-based approach. People interpret these things through the lens of their current paradigm, misunderstand a ton of things, take a low resolution slice of these patterns and implement them according to how they think they are, and kind of miss the mark, because they interpreted things in a way that wasn't actually as they were intended to be, and they haven't got the experience yet. They know enough, to think they know, but they don't know enough to realize what they don't know yet. So, yeah. So there's an argument there for installing constraints of some kind,
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's all good. Like you mentioned earlier, it's about experiences, right? So I think frameworks and all of these approaches that are more prescriptive, they're fine as long as people come with that mindset of, we're going to evolve and change these and contextualize, and we're going to learn from these, rather than just, hey, we're going to this is a recipe and this is what we're doing. And I think one of the challenges is that we've been so conditioned, right, over the years to think certain ways, to assume that, this is, and it's really hard to get out of that paradigm that we're currently in and consider another paradigm. And I was talking, I don't know how familiar you with Kuhn's cycle, the guy that actually came up with, so the guy that came up with the term paradigm, if you want, you look it up. But in a sense, I feel like, we're entering or a maturity of a current paradigm and entering a new paradigm, which I think, again, is where we're going to look at complexity differently and embrace complexity and look at it from a patterns and practices and leverage everything that we've learned, like you said, from, and maybe it came across that I'm bashing Agile and Scrum, but there's a lot of good stuff. It's just that most people don't have any clue what are the things, why Scrum, like if you read the Scrum guide or if you look at Scrum, let alone any other, they have no freaking idea what it is. It's just like, oh, it says on page 10, it says this, so therefore I shall follow it. Like, that's just blindly following things without fully understanding why they're there. So
and context is king, right? And one of the dangers is that the process becomes the purpose. Instead of asking, why do we need to change anything at all? Where are we challenged? What are our priorities? Where our current approach is inadequate to bring about the results we expect or wish to see? Because, one, if there's a clear why, then people can kind of contextualize why they're doing what they're doing. It also gives you something against which to measure outcomes and establish whether your attempts at improving things achieve anything useful at all, as well as monitoring the myriad of unintended consequences that are going to come as well as you mess around under the hood of complexity and forget you're part of it too. So keeping a focus on the need, on like what's the situation that you're trying to interact with, what's needed there, taking an iterative and incremental approach to those interventions and monitoring closely outcomes so that you can learn. It's bringing that agile mindset that people are so familiar with in terms of product and service development to the management of the organization as a whole as well, right? That for me is fundamental in my message around S3. When someone contacts me and says, we're interested in S3, my first question is, why the hell would you ever want to do that? Let's talk about it, but it's a serious question. It's like, let's look at where the issue is. Sometimes that's it. I can have an hour's conversation with a senior manager in an organization who's just curious about S3. And all we do in the conversation is make sense of what's happening right now that they can't deal with well enough and lay that out in a coherent way. And they go off happy as you like, because now they've got a clear why. And I say, well, get back to me if you think S3 might help,
Exactly. But it's just, and all you do in that instance, help them understand their context, and then they can decide what they want to do. You've said in one of the things that I've read or listened to that, one single pattern, S3 has a lot of collection of patterns, is the principles. Why is the principles one pattern that you highlight, or is it still something that, why are S3 principles so important?
Yeah, well, we think of principles as guidelines for behavior. They're like actionable guidelines we can consider. If people value principles, then they become values, right? And so another way of looking at values is principles that people value. the reason we talk about them as principles rather than values is who the hell am I to tell you what you should value, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, I can say, hey, look, these guidelines for behavior seem pretty useful actually on their own and together. Maybe you want to check them out sometime. Right? So the principles are principles. They're not patterns in themselves, although you could argue that each principle is a pattern because it's an actionable guideline. But the pattern is adopt the 7 principles.
Mm-hmm.
And that is when a group of people in an organization see value in those principles and decide to put them in place as kind of general constraints to delineate some sort of parameters within which action and decision making can take place. So they kind of guide and inform behavior. And why that's important is if you take a pattern-based approach to organizational change, sooner or later, probably sooner than later, you're going to bump into situations where the pattern isn't good enough. Mm-hmm. And so when you start messing around with those patterns, especially if you don't have a deep understanding of the ancestral lineage of those patterns and why they evolved the way they did, you need some higher order of reference to fall back on, right? Mm-hmm. And so the 7 principles provide some kind of guidelines, parameters. So when you start changing things, having those in mind is going to help you to refine those in a more sophisticated way than you might do otherwise. And at the end of the day, Miljan, it's not about using S3 patterns for the sake of using the patterns. Ultimately, it's about becoming more sophisticated, informed, more conscious, and just being able to make smarter choices individually and together to be able to navigate the myriad of challenges and opportunities that we face. And all of that comes down ultimately to the consciousness of human beings involved and their ability to make and evolve smart enough choices to be able to generate kind of outcomes that are life-giving rather than life-denying and take the organization in the direction that it needs to go.
Yeah, so, there's just something that you mentioned that kind of resonated with me. One of the principles is consent. And then if we look at the issue of how do we govern ourselves, right, in a complex environment. So in that consent, you mentioned Daniel Mezek and the whole idea of inviting. But in a context, if I'm a leader and I know I have a highly complex organization that I'm leading, that for me just to tell people what to do and coerce people into doing things is not a good pattern in the current environment, right? What are some of the things that I can do to design a system or influence a system that it's maybe more decentralized? Because as a leader in that instance, I would know that, decentralizing things, inviting people, creating governance structure that is more fluid, right, is going to help me and everybody else solve our problems. If I don't know that, if I go to, Miljan is an agile coach and Miljan is saying, hey, here's SAFE or here's this framework, and I'm blindly listening to what Miljan is saying, and I have no idea what he's the stuff that he's selling me is going to impact it. I'm blind in this situation. So my question is then, how many people in an organization, how much work do we need to do as change agents to help leaders and people in organization understand how much of their business is actually understanding the patterns and depicting these patterns and breaking them down to understand how they can do their job better rather than listen to experts on what to do? Because I use the analogy, you may have I don't know if you've heard it, but like chefs and cooks. We need both chefs and cooks. But if we have too many cooks and nobody that understands how to put recipes together, and our ingredients keeps changing, then we don't have enough people to come up with something delicious with what we have. And a lot of times in organizations, our ingredients are all the things, all the practices, patterns that keep changing. So what coming back to my question is is there a hope for organizations that are not investing in people to better understand, what we're discussing here, the patterns, the principles behind complexity management, I guess, or whatever you want to call it.
So you're asking, is there any hope for organizations?
Is there any hope? Because like nothing's working yet. Is there anything, going back to your question? Name, like it is working. Maybe I'm being a little bit more sarcastic than that. But there's a lot of failure when it comes to, if you look at, transformations and all of these, there's a lot of waste. So there's a lot more of what's not working and what's blindly being applied than what's working. And I'm generalizing it, maybe going to extremes. But is there a hope for organizations if they're not focusing on investing in their people and people understanding?
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe I could break that down into two questions. Is there hope? And if people aren't, if whomever has the authority to make the decision is failing to invest in people as a whole within that system, what does the future look like for those organizations? Then I would say that, especially in complexity, right? If we're in a clear or a complicated environment, then maybe you can just have automatons who just get on and do stuff. And if they don't, then you fire them and find someone else instead. I mean, that was kind of the rhetoric of the old world. But these days, mostly speaking, that's not going to be good enough. Because as you say, we're facing the complexities of the world. And you need to be able to harvest the collective intelligence throughout the system. You need people to be able to move fast for themselves. You need people free to create value as much as possible for themselves. Every unnecessary dependency eliminated, and any unavoidable dependencies clearly demarked with clarity around who's going to take responsibility for those, and people who are highly skilled in being able to make and evolve agreements that are good enough and safe enough to be able to proceed in an iterative and incremental way, and who appreciate complexity, who are able to embrace failure, and unexpected outcomes as all of them as kind of stepping stones towards learning and developing and being able to apply that, hopefully, to improve over time. So, and I could probably go on for another 5 minutes just laying out these different aspects that are so vital today. And I agree with you, because that's really bloody hard. And it's we are not good at doing that generally, on a even a moderate scale. We can struggle just in our marriage or something, with just one other person. So dealing with this at scale is not easy. So why would investing in people be important? Well, one, because there's a whole bunch of skills around organizational management that most people in organizations need to learn. If you decentralize organizational management, then when people take responsibility for that, they need to know enough about how to deal with the challenges and opportunities they face to do that in a coherent way within the system. But secondly, who wants to break their back facing all of those challenges if they're in an environment that's not nourishing and fulfilling and meaningful for them? So engagement is way down in the world. And with disengagement comes people just kind of, talking the talk and doing whatever they need to. But organizations need people who are in there with their heart and soul, right? And for that needs to be an environment where I'm nourished, where I'm energized and motivated to be. So the whole, let's say I'm a owner of a company, and all I'm interested in is maximal profit, and I speak the rhetoric of caring about people, but I don't really give a damn about them. But I just want profit, and I'm dealing with a complex context. It's irrelevant. I still need to think about the people, whether I want to or not. I have to, because if I don't, they're just going to leave. They're going to they're going to start up my ultimate competitor and eat my ankles out, Exactly. And on the other end of the scale, we've got people who are deeply inspired around creating human organizations, but that can go too far as well, right? On the other end, it's all about the people, but what about the organization and the reason it exists to start with? So on that side as well, there's this need for deep investment into learning how to manage organizations effectively, not just centralized, but that distributing the wisdom of organizational management to everyone throughout the system. And as you said, having a dynamic system where we can continuously move, shift around and redistribute power to influence in ways that help everybody ultimately to create the value for themselves.
Exactly. And it's not just about like, one of the things, I think it's that balance. And like, one indicator that we don't know what the fuck we're doing is like if pendulum is swinging too much one way or the other. So like a lot of times people say, oh, like hierarchy or command and control is bad. This is good. Like, I think it's just our ignorance and not fully understanding the full spectrum. And then being able to say like, okay, given the context, what could we experiment with? What type of things could we try out and see if it's truly working? And embracing that principle of empiricism and saying, can we at least what we can see and know and experience, figure out if this is actually working or not? And that's at least been my experience. What do you see as a future for S3? Like, what you envision? Or I'm assuming there's going to be, if I had to guess, there's going to be similar pattern-based approaches in the next 5 to 10 years. I'm curious if you think that that's going to emerge, or if you've seen it already emerge. And what is your vision for S3 in the next maybe 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, well, we've been continuously on the back foot in a way. The last years, Lily and I especially were really busy traveling around the world, helping people learn about S3. And in a way, we were a bit of a bottleneck to helping people learn about S3 exactly because of that, because so much of, this yourself as a learning facilitator or trainer, there's a lot that you can tell people face to face where you don't really need to be there. What would be helpful is engaging media and learning resources that can help people access that for themselves. And then you've got those aspects of practice, applying learning in practice, where it's great to have people with more experience who can be there and kind of offer feedback and, live as you apply these things on the go. So since COVID, we decided let's double down on resource development. And that's something that we've been doing a lot of. There's a ton of things we want to do with S3 in terms just like integrating and evolving things on the basis of objections that people have raised over the past years and insights that we've had. And also just to flesh out our articulation of many of these patterns, because it's no small task, because there's 74 patterns, and some of them you could write an entire book about, just one in and of itself, So that's something that we're working on right now. And so part of what we're aspiring toward is we're developing e-learning. We've got an e-learning program coming out in July, the Foundations program. And from there, we're going to break that down into micro-learning. We want to try and apply the spirit of S3 to itself in terms of how people learn. So what's your entry point? What's your specific need that you're facing, either individually or as an organization as a whole? And what's the minimal necessary aspects of S3 that would be valuable for you to explore so that you can learn about that for yourselves, start experimenting, and then connect with others who have some experience around that, so that you can keep your system open and learn as you go. So that for Lily and I especially, but Bernard, Lily and I, in terms of just developing the guide, is definitely going to keep us busy for the next years ahead. Yeah. And besides that, I think that for me is, like you say, there's so many pattern-based approaches coming up out there in the world. We're not interested generally in like reinventing the wheel or integrating those into S3. We've got a kind of niche in terms of areas that we're interested in focusing on. And then we'd recommend people elsewhere to look at other pattern-based approaches for different aspects of organization or complementary approaches, that complement S3. So for now, I think that's where we want to go.
Do you think there's going to be more collaboration between pattern-based approaches and people that stand behind those and communities that support them versus right now, if you look at the scaling Agile, like everybody's at each other's throat, or at least talking crap about the other, this framework sucks, our framework is better. Do you see? I mean, maybe that's a human nature, but if I had to guess, there might be more opportunity for co-creation and collaboration across these different pattern-based communities.
Yeah. Well, recently I've been trying to have more conversations with people who are more familiar or favoring holacracy, for example.
Mm-hmm.
There was a conversation with John, because I was really curious. I wanted to help share his story with the world around what happened at Zappos, because I just find him such a fascinating and wise guy to speak with. But I've had conversations as well with holacracy practitioners, and with Emmanuel, with Rendan Hay recently, and we said, let's try and get together and look at the kind of common roots out of which all of these different approaches are emerging. And instead of getting into arguments about what's better or worse, just looking at each of them in their own merit and seeing, some people like them for different reasons. So let's look at why and what the common needs are that they solve, and what are the unique value propositions of each of those two. So I think that's possible. Certainly, I'm very much heading in that direction and see the merit in those conversations. I don't think at the end of the day it's about any of these frameworks. Actually, it's not about holacracy. It's not about SAFe. It's not about Scrum. It's about stepping stones that help people to develop more conscious and intelligent ways of interacting with the world, and that's
ultimately, making our lives better, right? It comes down really to making the lives of everybody better, and not just, and going beyond that consciousness is also of human ego, maybe, making a better place for the entire planet, rather than just, and which goes back to the, we talked about not principles, but principles around like satisfying the customer and just not customer, but the stakeholders, and that whole ego, profit-driven kind of environment that we currently live in. Maybe to conclude here, what is something that I didn't know to ask, or what is one message that you would leave us with as we conclude here?
Well, what comes to me, I don't know if I can say it in an eloquent way, but clumsily, is, we're maybe as a species, we've always been at a kind of important moment in our development. But I think in recent times, we've never been so able as we are now to make or break the world, and we're so interconnected and interdependent on one another. I don't see how that can really go back the other way. So we stand in this moment with such enormous potential to achieve things beyond anything we can even imagine. And we also stand here together with the potential to destroy, I wouldn't say destroy this world, because I think the world's going to be just fine without us over time, right? But for us personally, there's certainly the potential that we could mess things up pretty bad.
It's getting easier and easier to fuck it up, right? So
yeah, exactly, and with bigger and bigger consequences. So and harder and harder to undo some of those consequences over time as well, right? So this whole question of how do we cooperate and collaborate together in more effective ways, I don't think it's just a nice idea. I think it's absolutely fundamental to the well-being of those who will follow us, that we right now invest our energy diligently and with some priority into figuring out more sophisticated ways to organize together, to communicate together, and to interact with this world. And I don't think we should underestimate the potential for negative consequences that flow out of that. And I also don't think we should underestimate the absolute extraordinariness of what we've achieved as a species to this point. Just look around you at what we've managed to manifest and the potential. And I would argue that is well worth preserving, and that this experiment is one that's worth running into the future. and to explore those vistas of possibility around what it would look like for us to realize our fuller potential during the time that this world will support life like us, and to make the most of this opportunity. And finally, to be able to look our children in the eye at the end of our lives and feel proud about what we've left them, and to be able to say, listen, there's a lot of mess and there's a lot of things we didn't do so well, but I really did my best here, and we're doing our best here, and to feel proud and at peace with that. I think that's an important reflection worth having for all of us.